Hey everybody, welcome back to another edition of the Security Repo Podcast. Glad to have you back with us as we learn more about security and everybody's security journey out there. Please like, subscribe, share this with your friends. It does help us out. Any social media give us, we really appreciate the love. This week I have a really awesome guest. He is a leader of a company called Scarf. I met him back at SRE Day in San Francisco this year. Welcome to the show, Avi Press. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. Excited to chat today.
So, curious, SRE Day. I'm always curious. How did you find out about that? Like, what was the impetus? Like, did you go to SRE Days before that event, or how did you find out about SRE Day?
I actually never had. I found out about it mostly because Scarf has done some work with Harness as far as their open source stuff goes. So we've helped them track some of their projects like Litmus Chaos that they have in the CNCF and projects like this. And yeah, so they invited me to speak about the talk that I gave that led to us having this conversation. But yeah, no, my background is really not in SRE at all, although I have a lot of software engineering experience. But we found that as we start to really get more into open source broadly, that really touches on so many different avenues of engineering, and so security, SRE, commercialization, all these kinds of things. It really ends up touching a lot of stuff, and I've been just continuing to get more and more interested in all these different topics and dive in really deep on them. So it's been fun.
Well, let's step back a little bit and talk about how did you get involved in open source, and like what does that path look like for you before you started Scarf?
Yeah, for me, open source, I mean, I guess my very, very first exposure to open source was really just as I was getting into computer science in college and just went really, really deep down the Linux, using Linux every day and, learning about the operating system and all these things was how I first got my first exposure to it. But then as I started really becoming obsessed with programming, I was just open sourcing everything that I was building. And so it was really just a matter of me building my own stuff that I wanted to build and putting it out there for other people to use or contribute to, etc. And then it just kind of evolved from there. I went on after school to become a software engineer at Pandora and was using a lot of open source. While we were just building, whatever systems we were working on. And then as time continued, I just kept building more dev tools for myself, just to make my day-to-day job easier. And the more tools I built, the more stuff I put out there, and kind of the more I got sucked into that kind of mode of just building stuff with people from all over the world. It was very fun. It was very cool, and it's great to see your work get used in all sorts of different places. So that's what got me really hooked on open source.
Yeah, I love the ethos, the mentality of we're just building it, we're sharing it, we're making stuff happen. And you're a person who makes stuff happen. You started a company, you started Scarf. Let's dig into that. What high level? What is Scarf, and why did you start it?
Yeah, so Scarf is a company that provides open source usage intelligence. So at a high level, we track what open source gets used, how it gets used, what companies are using it. We primarily, our business is around how we make money is around selling sales and marketing intelligence to companies that will commercialize open source. But this really all got started because I was once in the situation of being an open source maintainer. Having large companies using the tools that I was building, and nights and weekends are going and being spent fixing bugs from people at Adobe that are like, hey, there's a memory leak in this server, can you fix it for us, right? And so I found myself in this situation of, I was working at a really small startup at the time, and I have all of this, honestly, my open source was quite honestly having just as much engagement as the product and company that I was working at. And so I'm trying to make this decision: should I quit my job and do open source full time? And in trying to make that decision, I was really faced with the fact of how little visibility I had into how my work was actually being used and which companies were using them. And from sizing up my business opportunity to actually executing on it, I was very ill-equipped. I was distributing my software on package managers and container registries that gave me no visibility or information, right? And so being stuck in the situation and having none of that data to make an informed decision got me really spinning on this problem of open source distribution and the observability that comes with that distribution. And after talking to a lot of open source developers, what I kept hearing was, yeah, if I knew the companies that were using my open source, I would be able to do X, Y, Z, and maybe work on open source full time, or build a successful company, or keep working on this, right? Or maybe my business is about to shut down, and so that's what originally got us started on Scarf. And 6 years later, we're doing this at scale and starting to really normalize this as a practice in the open source world.
So you are tracking the metrics as people and entities pull down packages. That's all across all ecosystems, right? Like, is there like an ecosystem that you don't touch?
Our platform is pretty agnostic. I would say that we're technically able to track just about anything, but in practice, that has ended up being much stronger in certain programming languages and industries than others. Like, we do very little PHP right now. There's not a lot of people tracking PHP with Scarf right now, even though you totally can. But I would say for the most part, we process about 2 billion open source downloads, and how this is shaken out in practice is that this tends to be most representative for things like Docker containers, npm and Python packages, tarballs, Java packages. We do a lot of all of that stuff, and then some of the more niche languages, it ends up being quite a bit less, but we do it.
Right on. So one of the things you brought up at SRE Day in your talk, which I found interesting and which I've never really sat and thought about, is the distinction you're making between a user and a download. And it makes sense because we're in a world where non-human entities outnumber humans by 100 to 1. There's 100 machines for every human running out there, basically.
Yeah.
So how do you make that distinction between a user and a download? And does it actually matter at the end of the day?
Yeah, so it matters a lot. We spend a lot of our time on this exact question, and just to reframe this, right? I think the thing that a lot of open source folks end up asking themselves is, how big is my user base, right? I have 10 million downloads of my Docker package or my Docker container. How many people is that, or how many users is that, and what does a user even mean, right? And so what we look at here, the high level problem is generating some kind of stable identifier for an anonymous HTTP request, right? And you don't have an email to use. You don't have any PII really to use, although Europe and GDPR would disagree with me about what is an IP address really identifiable or not. And maybe that's a conversation for another time. But what we are tasked with doing is making sure if you've seen this entity before downloading. And so what we end up doing is having multiple notions of what a user means. That could just be an IP address, like, has this IP address downloaded a package before? Or we can go even deeper and start to look at other ways of fingerprinting a request. And so we tend to look at things like a user agent. We might have other headers, and sometimes, depending on the SDK, you might have other things that you might be able to report, like machine identifiers, MAC addresses, these kinds of things. And depending on the context, your ability to fingerprint gets better or worse. This is a very hard problem in practice because you can go too granular and then the fingerprint changes for lots of different things and it's not really useful. Or if you get too coarse, then everyone looks like the same person. And so finding that fingerprinting balance is a very non-trivial task. And so in practice, we end up just working with multiple notions of uniqueness for this domain.
Wow. Man, there's so many questions I have on the technical side of this. And if this was a
Yeah.
different podcast, we'd be digging into that deeply. But security is the name of this podcast, the Security Repo Podcast, after all. So there's a couple things I specifically want to dig into in the time we got left here. One is the fact you mentioned at the conference, like something like 94% or 95% of all open source downloads are coming from just like 1% of the projects.
Yeah.
Like what's the implication there from security? Like, does this mean, like, from an attacker point of view, like, you don't care about most pipelines, you care about that 1% of pipelines?
That's a great way to summarize it. Is that the attack targets are, at least in the open source world, um, there's some that just have several orders of magnitude more leverage in attacking than others. That's not to say that people don't try to attack that long tail distribution of software components, but when it comes to these really impactful attacks, um, whether it's like the log4j thing, the XC thing, or we see this over and over where there's these components in open source that are so tremendously load bearing in the ecosystem, in the open source supply chain. And this problem is just getting worse and worse over time. It's not getting better. The things that are really popular end up getting put into so many different things. People just build with them all the time. You have these same CI pipelines that just download those same packages over and over and over. And as these components start to become more and more relied on, they become increasingly load bearing and increasingly really lucrative attack targets if that's the kind of thing that you are doing. And so from a security posture, this just becomes increasingly worrying because the risk is just getting worse and worse over time.
So I guess the follow on to that is, are these providers, are these packages behaving differently? Not the people downloading them, but do you see any changes that they're making on their side as a supplier from the fact that they know that, look, the entire internet relies on us. We're a transitive dependency on everything under the sun. Like, are you seeing those projects respond in any way that you can see?
That we can see, not really. I mean, that's pretty scary about this, right? I think one of the problems with this, and this is one of the things that we're trying to solve with what we're doing, is that if you are a maintainer of a very critical open source package and you find a vulnerability in some version of that software, getting people to upgrade off of it when you put out that patch is really challenging. And I think, most of us who work on a product are familiar with this. You are begging your users to upgrade to the latest version. You're nagging them to do it. You're doing everything you can to get people to upgrade. And what the data says is they still are probably not going to do that. A lot of people just won't. But otherwise, I think as far as we can tell, I mean, I think a lot of maintainers understand the responsibility that they have. The reality is just there's just not enough hands, not enough fingers on keyboards to patch all the things that need to be patched.
Well, you actually brought up the other side of this, which is the user responsibility. And
Right.
that was the standout point that like left me jaw on the floor. Was, what'd you say, 80% of all package downloads are targeting latest. And on the flip side, like, if you ever download a pinned dependency, if you download like one specific digest, that's the only thing you're ever going to consume ever again for the rest of the time. Like, for most people you're seeing, kind of mind blowing.
Yeah, it's really scary. And to kind of summarize that for your users, or for your listeners again, like we basically see this very bimodal distribution in terms of upgrade patterns when it comes to open source. So the biggest group, they're just fetching the latest version, especially for things like Docker containers, where a tagged release is going to automatically become latest unless you are not, unless you prevent that from being tagged that way. Most people are just going to grab whatever's there, and that means that if you accidentally push out something buggy, people are just going to grab it, and that can be disastrous in some cases. And then for the people who are not doing that, they pin to their dependencies, and they very rarely unpin them or change them. And so both groups are problematic here. And being in the middle is just, unfortunately, there's not really a silver bullet to keeping these things up to date. It just is a lot of work to do. You just got to roll up your sleeves. You're gonna have the occasional botched upgrade. It's time consuming, but this is the reality of how to secure software systems today. There's not really a way around it.
So I didn't prep you for this question, but I do have to ask,
Mhm.
like, what do we do then? Like, if I am out there building software, what is your best advice? Knowing what you know, seeing what you see, what would you suggest? Like, just give me a few. Like, I know there's no silver bullets. I'm not asking for the world here, but like, what should I be thinking?
Oh, it's such a good question. I think there's a couple. Yeah, it's not all hopeless, right? There's a lot of work being done to address these problems, and so a couple things that I'm very excited about with this. So one is that so things like Dependabot, where in the past, Dependabot's just this very annoying thing. And for those that don't know, this is something on GitHub that will tell you, hey, you have bad dependencies. Here's, please upgrade them, right? And um, those kinds of things I think help, but they don't really do a whole lot on like legacy systems where it's just not so easy to just bump some versions and just think everything's going to keep working. And so that's where, quite frankly, I think AI techniques are really going to be a very important thing here. Where, yeah, some of this dependency bumping is maybe not completely trivial, but it's pretty solvable at the same time. So I think that AI coding is going to make very meaningful improvements here. Um, the second thing that I also think about from time to time here, and this is one of those things that as a functional programming enthusiast and as a statically typed programming language enthusiast, I think that today semantic versioning is kind of just a lie. Like, people will people will bump versions when they shouldn't, or they'll I don't know, just not follow semantic versioning for how things are being broken, or APIs will be broken or deprecated in practice. I think as people start to like embrace TypeScript instead of JavaScript, or adding types to Python, or these kinds of things, really empowers automated systems to do a better job of all of the work involved with updating packages, and then on the user side keeping your dependencies up to date as well, and making sure that we are tagging the metadata correctly, and that all these automated systems can be working together more seamlessly in a way that today I think is just very hard to do. Um, so I think that those kinds of improvements, both on static analysis of code and then also on dynamic generation of code, can basically attack this problem from two different sides in a way that I actually think in the long run will be very compelling. There's just a lot of work to be done to get there.
We're gonna move on to the part of the show where I ask all of our guests the same standard questions, so everybody gets the fair chance to answer these. So first up, what's your
Hmm.
all-time favorite security tool that you've ever touched or used?
I think one that I think is very compelling recently is Socket. Socket does some AI powered code scanning, so it's much less about, hey, can we do static analysis to find issues, and more, how much can we push what LLMs can spot when it comes to automatic code scanning. And what they have been doing, I think, is really compelling, because they've made it really easy to just add it to public GitHub repos, and the team there seems to be just iterating very quickly. And so shout out to Socket.
Right on. So you clearly have hired people because, well, you're a CEO and founder. You had to have built a team from scratch. Do you have a go-to favorite interview question you ask people as you're onboarding or trying to get them on the team?
I have a couple that I like to ask. One of my favorites, I think, is a really I think a less common question, but I love to ask people, you know, in the last year, say, or just in any time horizon that comes to mind, what's something significant that you've changed your mind about? And what I find is that some people, I think this is one that some people just really cannot come up with anything much at all. But others, I think it really it shows me what, like, how open minded people are to new ideas, and how quickly they'll update those priors. And I think in a startup environment, if you're really, really set in your way of thinking, it sometimes is a tough cultural jump to make to go to a new startup. And so at a small stage company, that's one thing that I really like to ask people. And it's a little bit more of like a managerial question and less of a technical question, but it's one that I really like to go through.
We're gonna play best advice, worst advice. What's the all-time best security advice you have ever heard or you're hearing out there out today?
I'm going to give something that I think is a little bit maybe a little bit counter to a lot of advice that tends to be given in the security world. And I think it's one that I think is still quite applicable that comes from more on the software engineering side, which is really to not prematurely optimize. I think that the security world tends to be, for very good reasons, like let's not move super quickly, let's slow down, let's be very careful as we move. But I think that one thing that I have still found when it comes to, especially in the startup world where I think we're making tons of security vulnerabilities as we go all the time. But in my experience, when premature optimization happens, and whether that's performance or whether that's security or otherwise, what I have found is that I think you're often spending time on, or you often are not allocating your time very efficiently, and maybe spending time on, maybe you're patching problems that were not the most, not actually the biggest vulnerabilities in your system. Or maybe you are just working on building something and you're securing something, and your company's going to pivot to something totally different in 6 months. And so I think, especially when it comes to early stage companies, being a little bit more, what we call in the functional world, lazy, right? Being a little bit more lazy and doing things as you need to do them, rather than doing a lot of things up front and spending a lot of time on things that may not have actually been the best use of your time with more information. And so I think I'm taking a little bit of more of like a software engineering and startup mantra, and I think it actually does apply to security in a lot of domains. And I think you can just as easily say, look, well, don't move fast and break all your stuff all the time. But I think you need to find a balance when it comes to earlier stage businesses.
I agree. I think that's well said. And it's something that's part of the reason I bring folks like yourself on the show is to have these opinions. And let's
Yeah.
flip that on its head though. And what is the worst piece of security advice you think you've ever heard?
One thing that has come up a few times, I think, is about the how safe hash IDs are. I think is one thing that has come up, at least in some security reviews that we have even done. Of like, oh, we're going to obfuscate our sequential IDs in our database using the hash IDs technique, and everything is going to be fine. They're not going to be guessable. And I think in practice, what we have seen is that that's like it's a nice thing to do. You should not put your sequential IDs out there, obviously, for a whole lot of reasons. But I think what in practice seems to be the case is that I think hash IDs are actually just a lot more guessable than we would like to think they are, is what I think we are seeing over time. Is that it's just not as good as like a UUID, where you have a lot more randomness in the identifier. That's only on my mind because that came up very recently in our own security audit about people saying, well, these IDs, I don't know.
The heart of it there is 100% something I've heard echoed a lot in like these worst advice is like, well, if you just do this, you're safe.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, you have a URL with a sequential ID in there. Oh, just put a hash ID on it. You're fine. And it's like, well, it's not really that simple. I think there's still a lot. There's still some risk there, and having a much more randomness in the ID is a good idea. UUIDs are good. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much for being here. Avi, we give every guest the chance to get anything off their chest at the end, give you the final say, as it were, before we finally wrap up and get out of here. So, anything else you got to share? Anything else you'd like to share? Anything else you'd like to tell us? The floor is yours.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I really like to talk about when it comes to this topic of security is that I think that often I hear the narrative in security conversations when it comes to data and privacy. This notion that as we collect more data, we are strictly becoming more insecure and more vulnerable because our attack, we have more to leak. There's more of a surface area to be attacked. And so uh, we shouldn't collect data because it's just a liability from a security standpoint. And I like to really bring a different perspective to this conversation that without really good observability, it's very hard to secure a system. And so I think I would love for just the security community in general, and really like the open source community in general, to really reframe the conversation about data collection, to be one that's less like dogmatic about, hey, like data collection bad, and really to have a bit of a more nuanced discussion about this, that hey, data collection is good in some respects, and something that we have to be careful about in other respects, and to get a better bang for our buck about it, and to have a little bit more nuance to that. Because what we're seeing when it comes to open source is that by having a lot more data on usage, this has helped us surface things from security trends that we are seeing, even to very specific things for like, hey, company, you are using this piece of software that really needs to be upgraded. So from broad scale trends to very specific recommendations for an organization, you need to be collecting data about usage of whatever systems that you are trying to harden. And so this balance, I would love to just have more people thinking about this balance and less about just really ideological debates about privacy.
That is a great way to end the show. Thank you so much for your insights and for sharing your knowledge with us. And everybody out there that made it to the end of the episode, thank you so much for liking, subscribing, for sharing this out there, and for letting everybody know there's no one true background in security. We're all in this path together. So thanks so much, Avi, for being on that path with us.
Thanks for having me.